I'm just going to make a few introductory remarks and then hand over to Ashish. But as I told him as I walked in, one of the reasons I jumped at the thought of doing this is that I have with me a story on Indian cricket that Ashish put together in 1986. It's a video cassette, right? Which I'm told is going to be digitized and brought out again. It was my first introduction to Indian cricket, 1986. And I'm going to ask you to sign it, but I thought that was a good little anecdote to begin with. So I have just two very specific points of context for today's session. One military and one political. The events that Ashish will talk about, and I'm going to let him talk about the story that's covered in the book. One part of it relates to the military history of British India, and especially in the Second World War. And I was going through, recently read one of these obscure books. I have with me the memoirs of Field Marshal Viscount Slim, Bill Slim, who headed the 14th Army in Burma, the British Indian Army. And a couple of references there act as a good context for today's session. This is what Slim had to say, and I'll just leave you the context because on a recent trip into Kohima, I realized that the 14th Indian Army was up against a Japanese force that consisted of several thousand INA troops, Indian National Army troops. And the confrontations between Indian soldiers under the Crown and Indian soldiers under the Japanese command is an interesting side story to that thing. And I just wanted to just mention it because it does form some part of the conversation we will have today. This is Bill Slim writing many years later, and I'll just read this. It says, on how fine a margin the success or failure of these decisions depended can be seen from the history of the Japanese thrust at Imphal from the east. There, from the 21st to the 25th, this is 1944, they resisted desperate night attacks, which were closely supported by Japanese artillery, while by day snipers and shelling took their toll. With the Japanese came the GIFs, as we called members of the Indian National Army, who were employed not in direct attacks, but in unavailing attempts to confuse and suborn our Indian troops. He then goes on to mention them as the Indian National Army. He refers to them as the Burma Traitor Army, right? Or as he calls them, the GIFs, the Japanese Indians, GIFs, right? And talks about how in the book that they were specifically used to confuse Indian Army troops because British Indian Army troops would then not know whether they were up against their own comrades or whether they were fighting the enemy. That is one context which I think is an interesting side story to this conversation, that we must not forget that the armies involved in that famous Kohima-Imphal battles around the Dimapur-Kohima-Imphal line, which the British managed to repulse the Japanese in 1944, had Indian troops on both sides. And when I started to read about who is the traitor, that's a very delicate subject, right? Are you a traitor because you are from the British eyes with the Indian National Army, or as some of the Indian troops fighting under the British Army looked at it as the INA being the traitors? And in fact, Slim mentions about how vicious some of those battles were, especially involving Indian troops on both sides. That's one context. The other, the one political one, is again, I was going through a biography a few years ago on one of the dramatis personae that you talk about, and that is Clement Attlee, right, the Prime Minister at the time. And in the book on this biography, it seems that Attlee had changed his mind from the time during the war when he looked upon India as a possible them being able to continue in India. But then by the time he came into power rather unexpectedly in June of 1945, changed his mind on it and especially the relationship he had with the then Viceroy of India, who's another dramatis personae in the book. That's Archibald Percival Wavell, and then, of course, with Mountbatten subsequently. I just would like to read one small section on this, and then I'm going to hand over to you on your presentation. And this is about how Clement Attlee saw the withdrawal of India as being timely, right? How he came to the conclusion that if we didn't withdraw, we would, in his words, Churchill's words, we would scuttle and leave. And in fact, the reference to scuttle and leave is to how they withdrew from Burma and how they left Burma in a perilous state. The next alternative was Wavell's plan for a hurried evacuation. This was indeed a scuttle, which would have left an even bigger vacuum than the one that emerged in Palestine in 1947. There was good reason to believe, and this was certainly feared, that a move like this would create such uncertainty as to spark a civil war. Finally, what would a Churchill-led government have been able to do to control the subcontinent while continuing to oppose independence? Years later, the future Labour leader, James Callaghan, went so far as to suggest that if Churchill had remained in charge, Britain would have ended up fighting a vast insurgency in India, perhaps even a full-scale war. Ultimately, Churchill had no answer to the single most important factor in Indian politics at the time: the desire for self-governance shared by the vast majority of the people. Britain was ready to quit India. Much more important was the fact that India was ready to quit Britain. Attlee realized this, as Lord Robert Boothby remarked, and having realized it, he acted with his usual speed, courage, and decision. So that's the context for the book on the trial that shook Britain, which is well divided. It's got obviously a reference to the actual trial itself. The Indian National Army's history is dealt with. And then I think the two important chapters which we will come to in our conversation is the repercussions of that trial in terms of the naval mutiny and the people's protests. And then, of course, the issue of the hastening of the acceptance of Indian independence. One final thought, and I was thinking of it just before the session. Hastening of independence, is that merely a matter of time or an acceptance of the idea itself? I think that's something we will talk about.
I think the title says acceptance of the
idea. Yeah.
Thank you, Siddharth. GIFs referred to Japanese-inspired forces. The British were very reluctant to use the term Indian National Army. And during the war, there was complete censorship. Therefore, the people of India did not come to know that an attempt had been made from outside India to liberate the country. And it's only when censorship was lifted after the end of the Second World War that people came to know what had happened and became very angry. So, to move on, first of all, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. And it's a great pleasure to be in Bangalore. It's one of my favorite Indian cities, indeed one of my favorite cities anywhere in the world. Although it's changed a lot, as I was mentioning to friends, from the time that I used to come here very frequently in the 1990s. But that said, I think I'd like to thank the Bangalore International Center for organizing this event. And the idea really came from Anand Arni, so thanks goes to him for having recommended the BIC. And is there an Arun Kumar here? Arun Kumar. There's this gentleman, he is a grandson of Colonel Loganathan. He sent me a message to say that he will try and come. Colonel Loganathan was appointed as commissioner for the Andaman Islands after the Japanese government handed over the Andaman Islands to the provisional government of Free India, which was led by Subhash Bose in November 1943. So I spent a year at Oxford as an academic visitor to research and write a thesis which has since been published as a book by Routledge. Educated at Cambridge, Subhash Bose was a charismatic left-wing leader of the Indian National Congress. He was twice elected president of the Congress. Having escaped from house arrest in India, he arrived in Southeast Asia ultimately in 1943 to reconstitute an Indian national army from Indian prisoners of war, which had the Japanese supporting it. The INA, as it was popularly called, became the military wing of the Provisional Government of Free India, which Bose formed in Singapore and headed from October of 1943. The INA, as a junior partner of the Japanese army, attempted to liberate India by engaging the British-commanded Indian Army on India's northeastern front. The INA was defeated, but the trial of its men at Delhi's symbolic Red Fort so angered Indians that continuation much longer of British hegemony over India became almost impossible. It's not so well remembered that the Indian freedom movement was either dormant or at a complete standstill between 1939 and 1945. In 1939, the Congress Party governments resigned from all 8 of the then 11 Indian provinces where they were in power. They did so in protest against Britain dragging India into the Second World War. Thereby, it sacrificed its commanding position in Indian politics. Briefly, the Congress struggle reignited with the Mahatma Gandhi leading the Quit India uprising. But this was brutally crushed by the British. Congress was banned as an organization. Its leaders and workers were imprisoned. The Congress was unproscribed when the war ended in August 1945. It was, though, at a loss as to how to revive the independence movement. This is when the British government's decision to court-martial INA men for treason fell on its lap. The Congress formed a 17-member defense committee to stand as counsel for the INA accused. The trial got underway on the 5th of November, 1945, with 3 former British Indian Army officers who had switched allegiance to the INA, Captains Shah Nawaz Khan and Prem Sahgal, and Lieutenant Gurbaksh Dhillon, charged as they were with waging war against the British King George VI. When asked how they pleaded, they emphatically and in unison answered, "Not guilty." The choice of accused by the British in what was a showpiece trial was unwittingly a Himalayan blunder. Khan was a Muslim, Sahgal a Hindu, and Dhillon a Sikh, representing the 3 prominent Indian communities. India detonated with a united fury. On the 16th of November, 1945, a mere 11 days into the trial, Lord Archibald Wavell, writing from the Viceroy's house in New Delhi to the British Secretary of State for India, Lord Frederick Pethick Lawrence, struck a note of distinct concern. "I have just had a letter from the Commander-in-Chief, namely General Sir Claude Auchinleck, expressing grave concern," he said, "at the possible effect on the army," meaning the British-commanded Indian Army, "of the INA trials." 4 days later, so on the 20th of November, 1945, came an alarming secret note from the director of the Indian Intelligence Bureau, Sir Norman Smith, to Wavell and to the India Office Library, the Indian Office, which was basically the ministry running India in London. So both to Wavell and to the India Office. The note said, indeed warned, the possibility of the development of the agitation, that is the public unrest in India, in dangerous directions exists in a degree which demands constant watchfulness, and the threat to the security of the Indian army is one which would be unwise to ignore. He also reported the appearance of threatening posters in Calcutta and Delhi, vowing 20 English deaths for every INA man hanged. Sir Norman cautioned that this does not make the position in respect of Europeans as satisfactory as could be wished. The next day, the 21st of November, 1945, violent protests erupted in Calcutta and continued for several days. Dozens died, hundreds were injured as police opened fire on Hindu and Muslim demonstrators, who, after decades of mutual animosity, were suddenly on the same page. The governor of Bengal was forced to summon the army to support police. On the 24th of November, 1945, in the midst of the Calcutta riots, Auchinleck communicated to Wavell, after careful consideration, I feel that reconsideration is the wisest. The evidence reaching us now increasingly goes to show that the general opinion in the army is in favor of leniency. A court-martial under the Indian Army Act could only administer one of two sentences: a death penalty or life imprisonment. Auchinleck, in his note, was already considering clemency. He argued, if the sentence is to be commuted, it can only be on the grounds that the men acted in good faith, and in that case, it would be illogical to imprison them. This was a stunning climb down in just a few weeks, from branding the INA men as traitors to accepting they might have acted in good faith. Wavell agreed with Auchinleck's thinking, and so, camouflaged from the Indian and British public, Operation Backtrack was initiated. On the 1st of December, 1945, Auchinleck received Jawaharlal Nehru. It was an unusual gesture. A commander-in-chief of imperial armed forces entertaining a relentless opponent of empire, especially when Nehru was in an overtly implacable mood. But it was statesmanship on the part of the general. On that, the London Times reported, he, namely Nehru, said that stories of exploits of the Indian National Army had led many younger Indians to question the Gandhi philosophy of nonviolence. Many of them were now thinking about the possibility of force as a means of gaining independence. Meanwhile, the agitation against the trial intensified as the hearing progressed. Bhulabhai Desai, a Congress leader and Bombay lawyer, was entrusted with the task of defending Khan, Sahgal, and Dhillon, and his was a heroic performance, which held Indians transfixed for 2 months and stirred them to a boiling point. Desai argued, here is a case in which I venture to say, and the evidence supports it, that it is not at all a case of what you might call 3 individuals waging war against the king. The evidence amply bears out the fact that these men charged before you were a part of an organized army which waged war against the king, even according to the prosecution. What is now on trial before the court is the right to wage war with immunity on the part of a subject race for their liberation. Desai submitted that the matter came under international law, for it had been a war between the British government and the provisional government of Free India, which the INA represented. He cited the American Declaration of Independence and pleaded, there was before the American people a conflict between the allegiance to the King of England and allegiance to their country. And they chose allegiance to their country in preference to allegiance to a foreign king. Leading the prosecution, the Advocate General of India, Sir Noshirwan Engineer, asserted, I submit that all charges against all the accused have been proved beyond any reasonable doubt. There is no defense in law to the charges against the accused. Then came strange doublespeak. He said, there is a good deal of evidence to the effect that what the accused did was done by them, not with any mercenary motive, but out of what the accused bona fide considered to be patriotic motives, and impelled by a sense, whether wise or misguided, of doing service to India. The accused were found guilty of the charge of waging war against the King Emperor. On the matter of sentencing, the court's hands were patently tied. It pronounced life imprisonments for all three defendants. However, as the confirming officer, Auchinleck decided to remit the sentences. So Desai lost in the courtroom, but prevailed at the court of public opinion. He swayed Indians, even a section of Britons in the British-commanded Indian Army, and the commander-in-chief himself. On the 12th of February 1946, in a note to General Officer Commanding-in-Chiefs under him, Auchinleck laid threadbare that any attempt to enforce the sentence would have led to chaos in the country at large and probably mutiny and dissension in the army, culminating in its dissolution. On the 2nd of March 1946, the Indian daily, The Statesman, quoted Nehru as saying, Khan, Sahgal, and Dhillon were not released owing to demonstrations in India, but because the Indian army had demanded their release. Earlier, in a foreword to a book which published the transcript of the trial, Nehru wrote, no trial in India, either by court-martial or in the civil courts, had attracted so much public attention or has dealt with issues of such fundamental national importance. Those three officers and the Indian National Army became symbols of India fighting for her independence, a trial of strength between the will of the Indian people and the will of those who hold power in India. And it was the will of the Indian people that triumphed in the end. Intelligence inputs about the disconcerting public mood in India, as exemplified by the Calcutta riots, and Auchinleck's second thoughts about the trials, resulted in Whitehall extending a hand of conciliation. On the 4th of December 1945, Pethick Lawrence made a statement in the House of Lords. The Times reported, the government regarded the setting up of a constitution-making body in India as a matter of greatest urgency. But public outrage in India rumbled on. So on New Year's Day 1946, Pethick Lawrence reached out to Indians again, this time over the airwaves. The Times reported he, the Secretary of State for India, believed the whole British people earnestly desired to see India rise quickly to the full and free status of an equal partner in the British Commonwealth. There was no longer any need for denunciations or organized pressure to secure recognition of India's due position in the world. The new formulation of equal partner in the British Commonwealth, though, meant persevering with King George VI as India's head of state. This was unacceptable to the Congress. Behind the scenes, work had begun in London to conceive concrete measures to meet Indian aspirations. The situation worsened. On the 18th of February 1946, mutiny broke out in the ranks of the Royal Indian Navy. A commission of inquiry into the revolt concluded that contact with the INA, the trial of its men, and political meetings, which whipped up pro-INA and patriotic sentiments, were among the factors that rendered the mutiny a political complexion. The Sunday Times in London, carrying a dispatch from Delhi on the 24th of February, described that strong racial feelings against the British, temporarily submerging the traditional Hindu-Muslim differences, undoubtedly underlines the recent outbursts of mob violence and naval indiscipline. You may recall that the All India Congress Committee, in its annual session in Lahore in 1929, had passed a motion demanding Purna Swaraj, or complete independence. For 17 years, British authorities paid no attention to the resolution. King George VI, in his address at the opening of Parliament in August 1945, said, "In accordance with the promises already made to my Indian peoples, my government will do their utmost to promote, in conjunction with the leaders of Indian opinion, the early realization of full self-government in India." Self-government still meant dominion status. So, on the 5th of November 1945, the day the epoch-making first INA trial began, Britain was only prepared to concede dominion status. But that position changed in a matter of just 18 weeks to acceding to complete independence. Matters moved speedily in London in the aftermath of the trial to culminate in an acceptance of the principle of complete independence. On the 15th of March 1946, Prime Minister Attlee told the House of Commons, "I hope that the Indian people may elect to remain within the British Commonwealth. If, on the other hand, she elects for independence, in our view, she has a right to do so." For the first time in Britain's rule of India since 1757, the word independence had been uttered at any consequential level of the British government, whether in Britain or in India. That too from the pedestal of the UK's Prime Minister. In the same statement, Attlee informed the House that the idea of nationalism in India had spread right through, and not least perhaps among some of those soldiers who had done such wonderful service in the war, referring to the British Indian Armed Forces. He could not have been clearer that the phenomenon of the INA trials, triggering the naval and other mutinies had disturbed the devotion of Indian soldiers in the British commanded armed forces. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much again for coming. The book has been, in a peer review, been recommended as coursework on Indian or South Asian history, which I'm delighted about. I hope you get a chance to read the book and enjoy it. I commend the book to you. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Ashish. Thank you. Can we actually give you another round of applause? Thank you. Very good. Thank you. If I can say in a lighter note, I'm really looking forward to the digitized version of this, because when you were speaking, I was reminded of your commentary on that all those years ago. Thank you so much. Thanks. I have a few questions and throw it open, but I have, while reading through this, and you rightly point out, the list of dramatis personae, involved in this. There's one person who, at the time of the trial, is not there physically. I just want your thoughts on. Obviously, it's not directly related to the issue of the trial and the immediate consequences of it. But can you just share some of your research and your thoughts on how Subhash Chandra Bose's presence is felt?
Yes. I think it's relevant and significant. First of all, after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered in the Second World War on the 15th of August, 1945. 3 days later, tragically, Subhash Bose, who was flying on advice from both the Japanese government as well as cabinet ministers in the Provisional Government of Free India, who was moving away from Southeast Asia towards Japan with an intent to enter the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, his aircraft, which was a Japanese Air Force plane, crashed as it just took off from Taipei airport. And so he died a few hours, 6 hours later to be precise, in a Japanese military hospital in Taipei. That same night, the 18th of August, 1945. So he was certainly absent when the trials took place. And as one British historian has said, that the ghost of Subhash Bose had suddenly amplified over the Indian scene.
Yeah.
But he himself was not present.
True.
When India became independent, or for that matter, in the aftermath of the Second World War.
So if I can just continue on that, because you have a chapter here about the rise of the Indian National Army and in its role in the war and the entire provisional government, etc. I'm not asking you to speculate, but just to tell, from a historical point of view, what was the nature of the Indian National Army, right? And in the way that he conceived it, and obviously not entirely his own. He had all his, various commanders and the others. But what was the vision for that Indian National Army, and especially in relation to the Indian national movement?
So in 1941, in January to be precise, of 1941, he escaped from house arrest in Calcutta, disguised as a Pathan. And he managed to enter Afghanistan, and from there finally reached Berlin, where his wife joined him. This was not known at the time, but his wife was an Austrian woman called Emily Schenkel. And Schenkel joined him from Vienna in Berlin. They had met about 8 years earlier in Vienna when he was in exile in that country. And as a matter of fact, she, despite the fact that she was Austrian, knew English very well. And so she acted as his secretary to write his book, The Indian Struggle. And from then onwards, the friendship blossomed, and they had got married secretly earlier at Bad Gastein
Yeah.
in Austria. And so in 41, after he escaped from India, he was reunited with Emilia Schenkel. They, as a matter of fact, gave birth to their only child, who now lives in Germany, Professor Anita Bose-Pfaff. There, though, there was one important point which needs to be highlighted, which is this, that he did approach the German government. It was a controversial thing to do, and I've criticized
Yeah.
Bose for it in my book, as you know. He wanted German support for Indian independence, which was not forthcoming. And his one and only meeting with Adolf Hitler was predictably a disaster. And so he was disillusioned. And in 43, with the Japanese much more keen to support Indian freedom, he went on quite a perilous journey from Germany to Southeast Asia on a submarine during the Second World War to arrive in Southeast Asia. And that's where the formation of the Indian National Army, or rather the reconstitution, I would call it, because the Japanese had swept across Southeast Asia during the Second World War. In fact, they had even arrived in Burma, which was basically at India's doorstep. And in that campaign, the British commanded Indian forces surrendered, and therefore they became Japanese prisoners of war. And from the prisoners of war was created the Indian National Army.
Yeah.
So these were Indian soldiers who had been with the British commanded Indian Army. They, having become prisoners of war, they were given an offer that you can either remain in prison or you can join the INA. And they opted to join the INA. So it was altogether 40 to 42,000 people who were part of the INA.
And as you say, on the face of it, it is a breach of an allegiance, right? You took an oath to serve king and country under British Indian Army. So it's a breach of that.
And the three were commissioned officers.
Commissioned officers.
Yes.
And the argument that Bullabhai Desai takes, I'm sorry, I'm moving on now, is that to put it loosely, that very oath itself in the context of a state that is seeking its right of self-determination, of independence, is questionable, right? And he draws upon the American context. That's perfect. I actually had one more point on that. You mentioned in the book towards the about the hastening of the acceptance of Indian independence in your second portion about the naval mutiny. And I'll just read this to you. Quite evidently, the trial of Khan, Sahgal and Dhillon turned out to be a major milestone on the road to Indian emancipation, not a mere footnote on the path. The consequent tsunami was similar to the impact of Gandhian non-cooperation and civil disobedience movement undertaken by the Congress. All three reflected reactions to what the party and the Indian people perceived as injustice, thereby carving a political opportunity. Each event triggered mass upheavals, and in the third instance, unlike the first two, it became for India's British rulers not just a law and order problem, but a danger to their physical well-being. If Mahatma Gandhi had stewarded the earlier mass descents, Nehru spearheaded the last, with Bose having in absentia provided the Congress a whirlwind to capitalize on. I say this deliberately because there's been, and probably catch one elephant in the room, there's been this amongst several canards that go around of late in this country, that it was only because of Bose and the Indian National Army that the British decided to quit. And if you've seen it on social media, there's a reference to some judge in Calcutta having heard it from someone who said Clement Attlee mentioned that that's the reason we quit India, which to any lawyer in the room is hearsay, because I haven't heard it myself. I heard someone else say it, right? This is a great description of how that is not true. It was all a continuum on a path. In fact, when I read this, I remembered one particular line, and you talked about Bose's, the authorship of his book with his wife, right, to help him put it together. I came across something, and I just want you to comment on this because I think it kind of matches this particular point that you mention here. This is Bose writing in his book about how that it is only because I say this because this is a deliberate statement against that. He says, this is Bose himself writing, and I quote, "There is no doubt that the Congress resolution, the Quit India resolution, came nearest in expressing the wish of the vast majority of the Indian people. It also brought the Congress fundamentally nearer the stand that I've always taken, that the destruction of British power in India was the sine qua non for the solution of all of India's problems, and that the Indian people would have to fight for the achievement of this goal. Mahatma Gandhi, in a stirring 90-minute speech, gave expression to his determination to fight to the finish, even if he stood alone against the whole world. A new chapter in the history of India's struggle for freedom has begun." This is writing in 1942. And I think it all comes up that in his absentia, the first three, the civil disobedience movement led by Gandhi, then of course the spearheading of the Quit India movement after most of the people had been put into jail, and then finally the consequence of the repercussions of both of the INA trials in both the public protests and the naval mutiny. Just your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, in 1920, Bose was still at Cambridge. He was a student at Cambridge, so he wasn't a part of that struggle. But fundamentally, ever since Mahatma Gandhi returned to India from South Africa, he laid the foundation for freedom because he converted what was an elitist Congress movement into a mass movement. And without that foundation, nothing could have moved forward. So 1930 was the next step forward when Bose was very active already. As a matter of fact, he had become president of the Bengal Pradesh Congress Committee by that stage. And although he was absent in 1942 because he was out of the country, he backed Gandhiji's attempt. Although, I should say something, and this is very interesting, that in that working committee meeting that took place in September 1939, which took the decision to pull out from all the provincial governments, Bose at that working committee meeting had proposed a Quit India movement then and there. So Gandhiji, though, wanted to wait. And so it didn't take place till 1942. But I think they were on the same page on this. And certainly it happened, although, as I said, it was rather brutally crushed, and therefore it ran out of steam in a few months. And as Attlee says, that what happened in 45, 46 was not 1920. It was not 1930. It was not 1942. It was something bigger.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right. So I have a couple more points that I wanted to take. It's not, again, in your dramatis personae, I don't know whether you specifically covered it or not. You've dealt with, of course, Nehru as an important role to play, the defense team, all of that is there. In your research on this, what thoughts about the trial and vis-a-vis the Muslim League and Jinnah? Because that's the other divide, right? As you yourself showed, right? That the Hindu-Muslim divide is, that classic one that can be exploited by the imperial power to justify remaining or, creating the two nations, etc. Just a thought. There's not much about Jinnah in the book, but I'm
no. I mean, there are references.
There are references, yes, of course.
To Jinnah, and I'll
he didn't
explain.
He
this.
wasn't persuaded to become to join the trial.
Let me come to that.
Yeah.
I'll come to that. So essentially, the poison of division between Hindus and Muslims was injected into the system from the very beginning of the 20th century. And so there onwards, increasingly, the two communities, they were being split apart. Then comes 1945, by which stage, obviously, the Pakistan resolution had already taken place, although there was a gray element about what that resolution precisely meant. But there was certainly an element of separatism in that resolution. That said, what I'm trying to establish is that the two communities had fallen apart for 45 years. And then comes this issue of the trial, when all of a sudden they are back together on the same page. It had never happened. Nehru has gone on record that never in Indian history has India been so unified as during those 6 months. That is the last quarter of 1945 to the first quarter of 1946. Now, obviously, the Congress took the lead to defend all accused. There were actually 800 men who were supposed to be going on trial. That, of course, didn't happen ultimately.
They abandoned all of that, right?
Yes,
so
I mean,
the moment
well,
the attitude changed
yes,
to this first trial.
exactly.
But
And
yes, please go
certainly
on.
treason was taken out of the context completely. However, the Muslim League also set up a committee to defend Muslim officers only. Now, as it happened, very few chose to be defended by the Muslim League. In fact, Shah Nawaz Khan was given an offer to be defended by the Muslim League, but he refused. So basically, it became a responsibility of the Congress. And in this showcase trial, all three were defended by the Congress, principally by this one man. It was a 17-member committee, all right, but it was an outstanding performance by Bhullabhai Desai. And a lot of people in Mumbai still don't know who Bhullabhai Desai really was. They know that Warden Road has been changed to Bhullabhai Desai Marg, and they know that he was a lawyer. But the reason why the name was changed and the honor that was given to him of that road being named after him was because of his performance in the trial.
And of course, this may be apocryphal, but the story goes is that Nehru donned his lawyer's robes for perhaps the first time after many decades and never
After
again.
25 years,
Yeah.
yes, that's true. And he was one of the 17 lawyers, but his task was really to take the issue to the masses.
Yeah.
So he looked after the political side of the campaign, if you like. He went from province to province, addressing rally after rally, and people were really aroused as never before. And as far as the actual argument in the trial was concerned, it was Bhullabhai Desai. I'll tell you a little bit more since we're discussing this. Prem Sahgal's father was a judge in the Lahore High Court. He took leave. As a matter of fact, he was granted leave. He actually resigned as a judge. But the governor of Punjab at the time said that you need not resign. Since your son is one of the defendants, you can take leave and go away for as long as it takes. So he came to Delhi, the judge, and that's Prem Sahgal's father. And it was he who made sure that it was Bhullabhai Desai and no one else who defended the three. Tej Bahadur Sapru was the chairman of the 17-member committee. But it was Sahgal's father who said that this is the man who's going to defend them. And he did.
I'm going to end this conversation, and we'll throw it open, on one other issue that caught my eye on this. You have, of course, referred to it, about how Auckland, like as Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, makes that rather sudden change, right? From saying we will hold them responsible as traitors, but then, and you draw it out. In fact, even in the Clem Attlee biography, there's a reference to how Attlee's views changed, as you mentioned. This is the question I have for you. Today, the Indian Army is a much revered institution, and which is still that colonial British Indian Army that has come down to us, largely. There is, of course, that other story as to how the INA got treated after independence, but that is not within the ambit of this book, probably elsewhere. But as an institution, as the military, as the armed forces, right? Just your thoughts on how this trial, I don't want to ask the what if. I'm not going to ask that. I'm going to ask you, what was, in your view, what's the consequence of that subsequently, right? In terms of the perception of the British Indian Army, because that perception continued as a very strong nationalist element thereafter. It's partly to do with the question of civil control that we managed to establish, unlike our neighbor across the border, over the armed forces. Those are larger questions. But just the idea of the sanctity of the British Indian Army then continuing as our army today.
One thing that happened was that in order to maintain discipline in the Indian army, the INA rebels were never taken back into the Indian army. Now, that was a matter of intense debate then, and even now, families of the INA soldiers talk about it. They regret the fact that their parents or grandparents were not taken back into the Indian army. But that was something that Auchinleck, having otherwise granted clemency, and he did it wisely, and there was a political expediency about it, and he realized that this is something that needed to be done more than Wavell. Wavell was supposed to be the political man, being the viceroy, and yet it was the commander-in-chief who understood the seriousness of the situation. So he did all that, but the officers were not taken back. So there was a question that although vast numbers within the British-commanded Indian Armed Forces believed that leniency was demanded, and they actually looked up to these guys as heroes, but at the same time, what kind of atmosphere might have been created had they been taken back?
That's the what if.
Was something that was up in the air, and therefore they were never taken back.
Okay. Before I throw it, I know I said it will be the last, but your answer or your response taught me. I will ask the one what if, perhaps, just to stir a little bit. What if it hadn't been Attlee as Prime Minister, but that old rascal, right, had been Prime Minister? Because Churchill famously called Attlee, right? I've heard of a wolf in sheep's clothing. Clement Attlee is a sheep in sheep's clothing, right? And, famously he said that, I saw this car drive up to number 10 Downing Street. It was an empty cab and out walked Mr. Attlee, What if it hadn't been? I know it's a great question for what
Okay, so let me give you a little background, which is this, that in 1938, this is before the Second World War, Attlee was leader of opposition.
Yeah.
And Lord Pethick Lawrence, who was obviously a member of the Labour Party, and with Attlee as the leader and leader of opposition, Pethick Lawrence organized a meeting between Nehru and Attlee in Pethick Lawrence's country residence. This was a secret meeting.
In 38.
1938. When Attlee assured Nehru that if the Labour Party came to power in Britain, India would be granted dominion status. So in 1939, the war breaks out, and Attlee becomes deputy prime minister in a national government, wartime national government. However, his opinion was still dominion status,
right,
because the 1945 Labour Party election manifesto promised dominion status, which is why I keep saying that consistently from 1942 onwards, when the Cripps mission came, from 42 onwards, the term that the British were using was conditional dominion status. So that remained the case right up to the start of the trial on the 5th of November 1945. It's only during the trial that opinion began to change, and finally, by the 15th of March, Attlee had made this famous speech in the House of Commons to grant the principle of independence, complete independence.
But I think by that time, Churchill, anyway, just as a.
And to talk about
Yeah,
Churchill. Now,
yeah.
he was, of course, the spoiled sport in
Yeah.
a way.
In fact, there's a reference here, I think here in the other book, which says Cripps mentions Churchill as that naughty man, who's trying to do all of the
He was
meddling around.
constantly questioning, even in 1947, he was questioning Mountbatten
Yeah.
about what exactly he was up to. So Mountbatten told him, and this was technically true, that in 1947, India did get dominion status. Because it was only when India became a republic that complete independence was achieved. So he actually told him a white lie and said that, "Oh, don't worry, it is going to be dominion status." But the fact is that the agreement was that this was only a lead up to complete independence. Right. And so if in July 1945, the Conservative Party, under the leadership of Churchill, had come back, I think there would have been a bloody confrontation between India and Britain. Yeah. And this is exactly the point that Auchinleck was making, that this is going to be worse than 1857, because British lives will be lost in untold numbers. And so to that extent, I think Auchinleck was right. And so to ease out of the situation, there was no alternative to A, granting clemency to the soldiers. Yeah. Number two, for Attlee, who appreciated Auchinleck more than he appreciated Wavell, to understand that the game was up. The game was up and it was time to quit India.
Wonderful.
A lot of cases, now I'm speaking about in today's context, are taken less as personality-based cases based on certain people, but are taken instead as symbolic cases. To what extent was this case a symbol of the Indian struggle against the Britons? Number one. And number two, I'm trying to rephrase this question, but to put it simply, what were the key takeaways by the British government from this case? Did they think about it from the perspective of this being a referendum of the Indian people against the British government? Because after a couple of years, we got independence. So, yeah, all right. Twofold question.
Okay. Didn't quite follow the second one. We'll come back to you when we take that question. Professor Vyasulu? Just a moment. We'll get you the mic. We'll take three questions. I think we'll then. Yes,
There was
please.
a reference to a naval mutiny.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little more about how that was related to this?
Yeah, there's actually a full chapter about it over here, and Ashish did talk about it briefly in his presentation. We'll just take those three questions, otherwise you'll probably get overburdened. Do you want to begin with that naval mutiny point first? That's more factual.
Yes, okay. So what triggered the naval mutiny principally was the INA factor. The fact that there were Indian soldiers who had been under the British command and who had defected to the INA to fight against the British. That example became an inspiration for the ranks in the Royal Indian Navy. And then there was the trial itself, which created a surcharged atmosphere in the country. So we are looking at the 31st of December 1945, when the three officers were sentenced to life imprisonments. On the 3rd of January 1946, these three sentences were commuted. And on the 18th of February takes place the Royal Indian Navy mutiny all over the country. So mainly in Mumbai, but also Karachi and
oh yeah, plenty. You talk about
25 ports in the country. It went as far as Aden,
yes,
where there was a Royal Indian Navy outpost. So that was certainly related to the INA phenomenon. The first question was about what Gandhi thought about Dominion status. I don't think Gandhi had any problem with the process as it was, that in 1947, India gets notionally independence, then and becomes a republic in due course. Gandhi's objection was to partition. That was his. Now, as it happens, this was put to the Congress Working Committee, and the Congress Committee overwhelmingly decided in favor of partition. Rather reluctantly, mind you, because Nehru's position particularly was against partition. And as a matter of fact, Gandhiji met Mountbatten towards the end of March and early April 1947. This was just a week after Mountbatten had arrived in India as Viceroy. And Gandhiji offered this formula to Mountbatten to say that give me a little bit of time and let me see if I can work out a united India. And his proposal, verbally, was that Muhammad Ali Jinnah should be made Prime Minister, and thereby India could remain united. However, the Congress rejected that proposal. And so Gandhiji himself was completely outvoted in the Working Committee. Then the UK's reading, well, obviously, over a period of time, Britain was giving concessions one after the other. The very fact that there existed 11 provinces, and the provinces had governments which were duly elected, was a fact that they were conceding partial power to the Indian people. But they were still reluctant to grant complete independence, and they were dragging their feet on that. It was only in 1942 that there was a partial response to the 1929 Lahore Congress resolution, which was a resolution for Purna Swaraj. In 1942, with Britain on its knees in Asia, with Japan having swept across Southeast Asia, captured Malaysia, captured Singapore, captured Hong Kong, captured Burma, as well as, been in control of Vietnam and Thailand and places like that. At that point of time, in a moment of great weakness for Britain, they sent a cabinet minister, Cripps, to come to India with an offer of conditional dominion status. It was never clarified as to what they meant by conditional dominion status, in lieu of Congress supporting the British government's war efforts. Now, the Congress did not agree to that proposal. And thereafter took place, the same year in 1942, the Quit India movement. So ultimately, you could say that Britain granted independence, kicking and screaming. But it's also true that although Britain won the Second World War, they were left very weak economically. They were heavily indebted to India. They were heavily indebted to the United States. So the economic side of things was also a factor.
Great. We've got a number of questions. Okay, I will take, at the back there. Okay, yes, the gentleman.
Just wanted to ask, why the mutiny only by Royal Navy, Indian Navy? Why not Air Force and military, army?
Oh, yeah, okay, we'll take that question. I'll take this side. Yes, sir. Yeah. Wait, hold on. Let's get you a mic because all of this is recorded. By the way, just to quick, while he asked that, the book actually has a reference specifically to why the Navy. But anyway, Ashish will respond. Yes.
Sir, were there any spillover effects of this trials in other departments like the Indian Civil Services, Police, Judiciary, etc.?
Linked questions. You want to just take those two questions first since they're linked? In the sense
Yes.
that, how did it affect other services?
Well, first of all, there was mutiny in the Air Force as well, in some of the bases, some of the Air Force bases. So it was not just in the Navy. And it was Auchinleck's fear that the greatest of their armed institutions, namely the Indian Army, would also face dissension if he had not granted clemency, because there were rumblings of discontent in the Indian Army itself. There was something interesting that he said. It was a note that he sent to London, where he says that the people in the Navy and the Air Force were more educated
That's
than
right.
in the Army.
Yeah.
And therefore, the chances of mutiny taking place was greater in the Navy and the Air Force. But ultimately, there was enough dissension in the Army itself. So for him to prevent that, he decided that there was no option other than to commute the sentences.
Yeah, that's right, because you do mention that it says, except that the two latter, that's the Navy and the Air Force, contain higher proportion of semi-educated men who are always susceptible to political propaganda and have less solid tradition of service and obedience to authority. But it's here in the book.
And regarding the civil service, Clement Attlee said that the spirit of nationalism had permeated into the civil service as well. And so it is not just the armed forces who were up in arms. The entire Indian people were up in arms. And the Indian civil service included, the elite service, was not above it.
This is a semi-personal question because my father was in what was called the India Independence League that Raj Behari Bose started at the beginning of 1942. And he also happened to be an immediate neighbor of Subhash Bose from January 1939 to the time that Subhash Bose disappeared. This thing about his having been under house arrest is absolute nonsense because his neighbors were coming and going all the time. And I don't understand how Subhash Bose could have disappeared in a car to Kabul when the police were supposedly keeping him under arrest. But at a different level, he joined the Indian Independence League in March 1942, and a group of 15 were trained in Penang and in Rangoon to become saboteurs in India. And they were sent in to different parts of India, 15 of them. All of them were captured soon after they entered, because one of those people who were sent in landed in Gujarat, and he turned an approver and he told the police where the others were going to land up. All of them were tried under Fort St. George. 4 of them were hanged. The trial was relatively secret, although prominent lawyers of Madras, including some of you may have heard of Govind Swaminathan, who was Sahgal's brother-in-law, was one of the defending lawyers. They were tried. As I said before, 4 of them were hanged and the others were given life imprisonment. They served about 3 odd years before they were released. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is, and the Indian National Army, for example, was first led by Mohan Singh, not by Subhash Bose. And Mohan Singh was treated very, very badly. He was tortured and all kinds of things were done to him. And then it morphed into Subhash Bose's thing. So besides the people from the former Indian Army who became part of the INA, there were other civilians and others who were part of Subhash Bose's thing. It's never been clear as to how many actually went into combat, how many actually lived through all the diseases that were common in Burma, how many of them starved to death because along with the Japanese there's hardly any food. I wondered if you'd like to comment on some of the things I've said just now. Because there was no uniform policy, either by the British or by anybody else, about what they ought to do.
Okay. would you want to take that?
Yeah,
right away?
okay. Because
it's
he
it's an
raises a
interesting-
number of
right.
points. Yeah.
Yeah.
To your last point, there were thousands out of the 42,000 who actually fought on the front. And they even came very close to capturing Imphal, as you know, and also entered Nagaland. It is also true to say that there were civilians in Malaysia and Singapore of Indian origin who joined the INA. They were, as a matter of fact, they didn't go to the front, but they were undergoing training during the war. Beg your pardon? Yes, but not to the absolute front, to the fighting front. And I'll give you one example, which is Lakshmi Swaminathan. Lakshmi Swaminathan was a doctor in Malaysia, and she married Prem Sahgal, as you know.
This Govind Swaminathan is
Correct.
a
Yes,
brother.
I know that. I
Yeah.
know. So now she was obviously a civilian, and she later, after she joined the INA, headed the Rani of Jhansi regiment, the first full women's regiment. Now they were just behind the battle lines, serving in nursing capacity to the men who were fighting. But they were not far from the front, but they were not actually at the front. And this applied to the civilian men as well. As far as the landings that you say, it is absolutely true that landings did take place along the Indian coast, and people were captured. Some of them were hanged, and lots of them, including one, I would say, husband of a niece of Subhash Bose was one of them who was arrested. He was given a death sentence, but ultimately, I think Gandhiji's intervention prevented the worst. The Indian Independence League was rightly headed by Raj Bihari Bose, but then he handed over in July, as a matter of fact, a little bit earlier, possibly in May 1943, to Subhash Bose. So Subhash Bose became president of the Indian Independence League, which formed the Provisional Government of Free India, which under its wing had the Indian National Army. So that was really the thing. As far as his escape is concerned, well, he didn't meet a lot of people in the last month before his escape. So what happened was this, that he was in prison, in Presidency Jail in Calcutta, and he went on a hunger strike. So the governor of Bengal decided to release him. And he made this famous statement that he was neither on bail nor is he in prison. So Bose went home with this plan to escape. And he didn't meet people other than one or two who were part of his plan, including one nephew who drove him out that night from Calcutta to a place called Gomo, which is now either in Jharkhand or Bihar, one of the two. It was in Bihar at the time. And from Gomo, he boarded a train to Delhi, took a connecting train to Peshawar, and from Peshawar he crossed, with the help of his forward bloc people, crossed over into Afghanistan, and he was disguised as a Pathan. So, and there were police, but they were sleeping in the middle of the night. In a cold January night, they were fairly asleep. And so that was the opportunity. That's how they had planned it. I mean, it could have gone wrong, but it didn't.
I wanted to ask about what prompted Lord Wavell to go for a public trial. It was politically completely a suicidal move. Any thoughts on that?
Okay.
And if I have the liberty to ask a connected question?
Okay, we go ahead quickly.
From my readings, I have what I have picked up is Congress didn't support the RIN. In fact, Vallabhbhai Patel dissuaded them from going on mutiny. Would like your response.
Okay, so there are two separate questions there. All right.
Hi, thanks for that. Super interesting. You used the phrase injected tension between sort of Muslims and Hindus in the early part of the 20th century. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that looks like. And relatedly, it does seem quite short-sighted to have a symbolic trial that might unite Muslims and Hindus. So how did that come about?
Okay. So I think that question and the question about why Wavell led the trial, I mean, why would a trial, a public trial, what is the benefit for the colonial administration? And it's kind of linked. We'll come to the naval mutiny in a bit. But,
Yeah, but let me start with the reason for the trial.
reason for the trial.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was not really Wavell's decision, although he supported it. It was a cabinet decision of the British government. And Clement Attlee is on record that we cannot allow these rebels to get away, and set an example that it's a very easy thing to do, that to rebel against the government. And as a matter of fact, in this case, it was army officers who had defected and dismissed their oath of allegiance to join the Indian National Army. So it was really the British cabinet which instructed the British government in India to go ahead with the trials. But it's also true to say that both Wavell and Auchinleck, on the 31st of October 1945, were very, very enthusiastic about the trial. They actually said to London that officers and men in the Indian Army wanted the three to be tried for treason. And this, despite the fact that, number one, two lawyers, Bhulabhai Desai and Asaf Ali, had written a letter to the Viceroy to say that this is not a very wise thing to do, because public opinion in India was very much in favor of the INA. Even Gandhiji wrote a letter, but all these were ignored and they went ahead with the trial. But within days, they found out that it had been quite a blunder. So about the Navy, you said, how is it that they were, what was the question?
Yeah.
My question was, why did Congress support the
Oh, yes. Now, that's a very good point. Actually, it's like this. The Congress was divided. So, number one, Gandhiji did not approve of the mutiny. That's a fact. As a matter of fact, Vallabhbhai Patel negotiated with the mutineers on behalf of the British government. So his line was also very soft. But Nehru's line was different. He took a pro-mutiny line. So Congress were divided on that. Regarding injection of this infection of communal division, this really started with the British encouraging the formation of the Muslim League. And then Bengal in 1905 was divided, which was essentially on communal lines. The east of the province was predominantly Muslim, and West Bengal was predominantly Hindu. So they divided the state on communal lines. Of course, there was such agitation in protest that this decision had to be overturned. And so in 1905, the British divided Bengal, but then in 1911, Bengal was reunited after a sustained period of opposition when both Hindus and Muslims came together. But in the meanwhile, the Muslim League had come into being, and increasingly the British authorities were clearly encouraging the Muslim League to come up as a rival of the Congress. So that certainly culminated. As a matter of fact, Lord Linlithgow, who was Viceroy, told Muhammad Ali Jinnah that you need to do something positive. You are being seen as constantly opposing the Congress and not doing anything positive. And so encouraged him to come up with something like the Pakistan resolution, which Jinnah did.
Okay, thank you. Other than the INA between 1757 and 1947, were there other large, at the scale that you mentioned, 40,000 plus, organization of military against the British?
You mean mutiny?
Not a mutiny, but an organized army like the INA. Was there a
Oh,
parallel
I see. Okay, all right.
in these
Okay.
200 years?
Okay.
I have a communication angle question to all of this. There's one side of communication that's going out to the general masses in India about what's happening with INA, these trials, and so on, and there's an amount of agitation that's coming up. And there's an amount of communication that's happening between England and officers in India. And this is a time when communication channels are not so real time. So how is all of this happening? Because these are happening day by day, week by week. It's too fast. How is that going on?
You want to answer that? Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
okay.
Which one?
I'll take it one by one. Now, the pre-INA question is important because the first chapter of my book deals with what gave Subhash Bose the inspiration to create an army like the Indian National Army outside India and to try and liberate India from outside the country. Now, there are three examples, nothing as big as the INA, nothing in the form of an organized army, but there were movements which were violent movements. You know, I make the distinction between use of force and Gandhiji's nonviolence. Now, if you are talking about use of force, and this, by the way, philosophically, was the difference between Gandhi and Bose. Bose said, let's use force over and above nonviolence. Gandhiji refused that idea. So there was this ideological difference between the two. Bose and Nehru were on the same page on social and economic matters. But Nehru also felt that he needed to go along with Gandhi as far as nonviolence was concerned. But they were all Congress leaders with the same objective. Now, prior to the INA movement, there was the Gadar movement, which was taking place from outside India. So that was a good example. Then there was what was called the British called them terrorists, but people who used violence in Bengal. The nationalists in Bengal who used violence, who used use of force. They actually assassinated British officers. They threw bombs. And so that was, again, and such like. There was obviously the example of 1857, which gave Bose a great inspiration. In fact, the story goes that when the Indian National Army launched their campaign from Burma, he visited, prior to that, Rangoon, now known as Yangon. And there he went to Bahadur Shah Zafar's grave and he wept inconsolably. So that was an inspiration. So those were the examples that he developed in his mind to create the INA. As far as, yeah.
Just make a quick reference
Sure.
to the book again. And I think, just to put a little plug on the book, you should pick it up. The INA motto was also coined, this is from the book, was also coined in Hindustani, more Urdu. Itmad, I don't know if I'm pronouncing all of this right, Ittifaq and Kurbani, meaning faith, unity, sacrifice. Bose was markedly successful in welding camaraderie between India's diverse linguistic and religious groups who under the British were imbued with rivalry and tension, especially between Hindus and Muslims. Right? So that's just one thing. Yes, please.
Yes, and he believed in Hindustani being the common language, which was basically a blend of Hindi and Urdu. I mean, he himself was a Bengali, as you know, but he had learned the language, and he believed that that was a unifying language for India across the board. Regarding communications, those were days of cables, telegrams. So between Delhi and London, cables were going to and fro all the time. And these were secret cables which would arrive in an hour or so couple of hours, maybe if they were urgent. And that's how the government, that is the British government, were communicating between themselves. So Wavell to the Secretary of State. Sometimes, as a matter of fact, when the Royal Naval Mutiny took place, that's when Attlee was very angry. Because he said to these guys in India that you have not kept me informed in such a serious matter. So what had happened was that the cables had gone to the Secretary of State and to the Department of Defense.
But not to the Prime Minister.
But not to the Prime Minister. And he said that, I went into the House of Commons to make a statement and people were asking questions about the mutiny and I wasn't briefed about it. So there was a little bit of a gap here and there, but in those days, cables, newspapers were published fairly regularly and there was radio. There was the arm of the BBC in India, then the All India Radio.
There's a reference, I think, in the book. He says about the point about how some of these cables are marked. Is it marked top secret, most urgent? And as you will bear out, right? These are cables sent from Delhi to London. And in return, sometimes, remember, we're talking of December and January, Delhi, but in the summer, it may well have been from Viceregal Palace in Shimla, right, to thing. And so you'd have corresponding, you'd have the original message, as I found in the archives, you have the original message in Delhi, the copy is out in London, and so on and so forth. But yeah, the cable was, and depending on how it was marked, you, I think, bring that out over here.
Yes, exactly.
Most urgent, top secret.
Correct,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think Attlee was distinctly unhappy that these messages had not been A, given topmost priority, and B, that they had not been directed to him personally.
On that lovely note, thank you again, Ashish, so very much for this, and thank you for all. It's been a great thing, and you should, hopefully the next time you visit, it will not be 20 years, but sooner. And thank you again so much, and good night. Thanks.
Thank you very much.